Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Belong Network. Just while we're waiting for one or two other participants to join us, perhaps I can mention that we have a chat function for you to introduce yourselves, to say who you are and where you're from, and actually put your camera on for a short while as well, just so that we see you too. My name is Ted Cantle. I'm chair of Belong, the Cohesion and Integration Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. I know sometimes we all feel a bit zoomed out, but I've actually been looking forward to this seminar. We've got a great bunch of panelists, and we've got a really good report on one of the most important subjects. So welcome to everybody. Can I also tell you about the Q&A function, which you should find on the bottom of your screen. And the Q&A function is for you to be able to ask questions, which I can then put to the various panelists. Obviously, once you've introduced yourselves and we've seen you on camera, and you've used the chat function, perhaps you would mute yourself and turn off your camera, and we'll focus on each of the panelists when they come into operation. I just wanted to mention the background to the Belong and Cohesion Network. We've been going for a couple of years, and like everybody else, we've had a very strange last year at least, but actually we've been able to do some great work, including this report and a companion report prior to that. And I think we've really been able to highlight the importance of cohesion following the pandemic, when people, I think, really did demonstrate that they wanted to connect with each other. And I think the whole basis of a community was coming under scrutiny, and it fared pretty well. So it's been a difficult year, but it has been an interesting and important year. From our point of view as the Belong Network, our aim is to connect people, this webinar being a case in point, of course, but via our website and all the other events and activities we've had, to share resources, to share ideas and develop new ideas, and most of all, to develop practice. That is really what motivates us more than anything else. It's to influence the way cohesion and integration, volunteering, and all the other community activities are actually done to improve the sense of unity and belonging that we all hope to have. So there are lots of other examples of this work on our website. The power of sport, for example, which we have developed guidance for and will shortly be developing into a fully fledged toolkit. I think all of these, the Radical Kindness Project, the Shared Ground training programs, they're all really there to make sure that we are developing a way of sharing ideas and sharing resources and making practice so much better in the future. So today's webinar is very much a part of that. This is following some pretty extensive research, and with our University of Kent as a key partner in this, which is part of a longitudinal study, incidentally. So this is a real opportunity to extend the research in a way, again, which highlights the importance of belonging, and most of all, again, develops into practice. So this seminar really using that report to say, how should practice change? What are the key ideas and recommendations to improve practice in the future? And I would just like to thank our partners, the various local authority areas that have participated, Bradford, Walsall, Waltham Forest, Blackburn with Darwin, Corderdale, our partners in the voluntary sector, Spirit 2012, the Joe Cox Foundation, Street Games, Volunteering Matters, Near Neighbours, the Linking Network, Sporting equals an NCS, and any I forgot to mention as well. We're very grateful for the time, the resources, and the support which they have given us. So each of our panelists, I'll introduce them as each one pops up onto your screen, but each of our panelists is going to speak for a relatively short period of time. We want to leave as much time as possible for discussion and questions. And at the end of that, obviously, we will try and make sure that questions are developed and fielded. And as I said, don't forget to use the Q&A function in order to ask those questions. So our first presenter is Joe Broadwood, who is Chief Exec of Belong, of course, and has done a great job in this difficult period, getting us started over the last 2-3 years, and building the practice, building the website, and I think creating an organisation that really lives up to the ambitions that we all had. So, Joe, I'm going to hand over to you. Are you muted?
I am, of course. Thanks very much, Ted. I'm just going to get the slides up. So, Kaya, if you would get the slides up, that's brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to sort of make some assumptions, really, that people are already familiar with the research project and have perhaps looked, if not at the detailed findings, but at least the executive summary of our recent paper, which was our interim report into the research, because this paper that we've just launched is very much a companion piece to that, and very much draws on that analysis and kind of takes and sort of draws some conclusions from that. So if I could just have the next slide, please, Kaya, thank you. So the research aims to understand how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected relations between individuals, communities and the state, and whether integration and intergroup relations are improving or fragmenting at regional and community levels as the pandemic progresses. It's been funded by the Nuffield Foundation. We've been surveying since April last year, so we managed to get going quite quickly as the pandemic started to unfold, and we will continue until August of this year. So we hope to provide a really comprehensive overview of how the pandemic has impacted social cohesion across the UK. So if I can move on now, Kaya. Thank you. And I think, you know, one of the things about our research is it's very much adopted a place-based rather than a UK-wide approach. So we've surveyed and spoken to people in 3 politically coherent parts of the UK, Kent, Wales and Scotland, via our community partners that Ted's already referenced, and in 4 metropolitan areas since December 2020, and in 6 local authority areas, which we're going to be talking about mainly during this presentation. And those areas, 5 of which were part of the MHCLG integration area programme, and the 6th, Calderdale, which, although it wasn't part of that programme, has prioritised kindness and resilience in its strategy over the last 3 to 5 years, and has got a lot of very strong leadership around social cohesion. So just to say a little bit more about the 6 areas, they are very different from each other. They're geographically and demographically different, but also have you know, quite different social and economic histories. And so when we did our analysis of our findings, we controlled for a lot of those differences, and yet still the findings that I'm about to share with you or shortly held across all of those 6 local authority areas. I'm going to, just before I talk about the findings, I'm going to talk about our models for assessing social cohesion. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So we drew on validated models in the social sciences to determine the most relevant indicators of social cohesion. And according to most models, social cohesion is manifested at 2 levels: in the relations between the individual and the state, and the individual and in the relations between individuals and their fellow citizens, and that can be other individuals, groups and communities. And so on the slide you'll see some of the things that we measured, such as trust, both trust in local MPs, but also trust in local government, trust in other people, but also looking at the quality, quantity, density of social relations, and also perceptions of COVID-19 restrictions. And I think our research has produced some really important and valuable findings. And as I said, I'm not going to cover all of them, but today I'm just going to focus on the findings in our interim report, which are around the impact of an investment in social cohesion locally. So some of our findings, if I could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. And maybe the next one as well. Thank you. In June of last year, we reported that the 6 local authority areas were showing greater trust in politicians, greater trust in other people, a higher level of local trust, better connections with family and friends, warmer feelings towards others, including migrants to the UK, and higher levels of neighbourliness and active social engagement, which are things like signing a petition, donating to a cause, and volunteering. And in our most recent interim report, we're able to show that for the most part, these areas have maintained higher levels of cohesion. So on our next slide, you will be able to see that that's been in a variety of forms, including neighbourliness, active social engagement, and sustained inclusivity towards others. And strikingly, residents in these areas are twice as likely to volunteer compared to other areas. So if we take a closer look at this in this graph in the next slide, if you look at this graph on neighbourliness, which is one of the key indicators of social cohesion, we can see that in June, when there was quite a lot of solidarity, most places felt neighbourly, but the local authorities were up there at the top with Wales. And over the time, I think the most important thing to note is that actually the local authority areas maintained this over time, and it's a relatively straight line and shows that it was sustained across the whole period of the year, despite those 4 of those areas often having much higher levels of infection rates and restrictions than elsewhere. And then there's a similar picture when we look at active social engagement, which is on the next slide. We can see a much higher level in the local authorities than in the other samples, and it's strikingly higher, I think. And I think overall we're seeing that these are the places where respondents seem to be much more engaged and interested in working with and for others in their local area. So I think, you know, one of the conclusions we can take from this is that a relatively modest investment in social cohesion by central government actually reaped considerable benefits in those local areas. And we think social cohesion is going to be absolutely crucial in tackling the challenges ahead. So we were really curious to learn from the local areas, what had they done and what approaches might they have in common. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I think central to our inquiry is this notion of social cohesion as both a state, i.e. something that you can measure at a moment in time, and a process, something that needs to be maintained and attended to over time in order to reap the most benefits for communities. And the best analogy I can come up with is like a garden or an allotment, where there are a number of different elements which need to be paid attention to develop those optimal growing conditions. So soil, nutrients, amount of sunlight, is it north facing, south facing, you know, the types of plants, the richer biodiversity, the more likely you are to attract pollinators and other beneficial wildlife. So it's about paying attention to all those conditions that can help social cohesion to thrive. And just like a garden can rapidly become a weed-infested mess if you neglect it, then I think that's also true about social cohesion. It needs to be maintained and paid attention to over time in order to keep providing those benefits. So with our research partners, in order to learn more about their programmes and to identify the shared themes and the factors in common, we presented them with a framing paper based on the social cohesion measures we'd used in the research. And in particular, we asked them about relations between local government and institutions and local communities, and thinking particularly about those groups and communities who were underrepresented or least engaged. How would they address that? relations between individuals and other individuals, groups and communities. And we asked them particularly to think about those groups who didn't usually mix. What had they done to try and bring those groups together and to foster greater empathy and a reduction in prejudice across those groups? And I think for both of the above, trust is a key mechanism for engagement. And finally, we asked them about systemic barriers to cohesion. You know, maybe those factors that it wasn't in their governance or power to affect so much, for example, segregated housing and segregated education. How had they mitigated the impact of some of those barriers and also wider inequalities and its differential impact on particular local groups and communities? And when we looked at their answers and really tried to analyse across all of those programmes, I think what we could see was that their approaches were rooted in what we would call these 4 common pillars. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And I think central to all of their approaches is this idea of place and an understanding that different strategies to address social cohesion are needed in different places. And each of the 6 local areas grounded their programmes in knowledge, and that was both knowledge from local people and, you know, in terms of communities, groups and cultures, but also data and evidence, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, in order to respond to the distinct and unique challenges and opportunities in that place. And then finally, they put a lot of effort into understanding what the systemic barriers to social cohesion were and putting in place strategies to mitigate them or overcome them. For example, working with the National Citizen Service and the School Linking Network in places where education has become segregated by, for example, faith and race, and then using arts, cultural events programs to bring different residential neighbourhoods together in shared events to celebrate a sense of belonging to a bigger sense of place. So I'm going to talk about the first 3 of these just a little bit more detail. So first off, if we can just go on to talk about place. I think, you know, we all know that place really matters. But I think what these areas had in common was developing a shared vision about a place, which says that this place is a good place to live, work, raise your family and grow older in. And I think that's been a key characteristic of all of them. And central to that has been the role of local government, reimagined as a co-producer, convener and enabler. So very much working alongside local communities and groups and devolving power and decision making to them to be able to make decisions about their local place. And although they didn't shirk from addressing and being transparent about some of the challenges, they really promoted and celebrated what's unique and positive about their locality, including the people, groups and communities that live there. I think the other thing to point out is that although only about half of the public expenditure in a given local area is funneled through local councils, they were excellent at really building cross-sector partnerships which brought together public funded agencies, for example, housing, educational trusts, universities, health and criminal justice sectors, to kind of marshal their resources towards that shared vision and plan. And again, they used art, sport and cultural events to really sort of put communities in charge. So Ted's appearing on my screen. I've got another couple of slides, Ted, so bear with me. The second one is around people, so if we can just move on to that. They really took a strength-based approach, seeing local people as a place's biggest assets, promoted and encouraging all forms of active social engagement by starting with the issues that local people wanted to focus on. And they engaged diverse voices, groups and communities, and in particular recognised young people's role as leaders and connectors. And at the same time, they were really proactive in addressing tensions and difficulties that may arrive. And then social mixing was embedded as a principle in procurement and commissioning processes. And in all of this, local leadership was absolutely crucial in terms of framing a vision and communications in language that actively valued diversity and inclusion. In terms of knowledge, they really valued the research that we were able to provide, actually, as it provided there was some specific data on social cohesion measures and allowed them to compare and benchmark with other areas. They, as I said, really made efforts to understand inequalities and how they played out. They built the competence and capacity and skills of knowledge on social cohesion across all sectors, but in particular built the capacity of the voluntary and community sector, and weren't afraid to bring in specialist knowledge from outside to really complement what they were doing locally. So I'm just going to move on now just to talk about our recommendations. So this is our last slide. I think, you know, one of our reflections is that local social cohesion is profoundly affected by national and international actors and events, and decisions taken in Westminster, the Senate and Holyrood can directly impact social cohesion locally and regionally, and in particular those narratives of us and them. And I think we're in agreement with Danny Kruger and others who are arguing for greater capacity and scope for local communities so that local people can design and deliver the kind of neighbourhood they want to be part of. I think we would say that the 6 local areas that are taking part in this research project have already embraced that philosophy and approach that puts local communities at the heart of creating kinder, more connected and empowered local places, and for a relatively modest investment. And I think we would argue that these principles need to be embedded at the heart of national policies and programmes for recovery and renewal. And we now know that investing in cohesion works in terms of building trust. And trust is going to be vital for the delivery of the recovery from COVID. I mean, for example, you know, in terms of vaccine rollout, trust is absolutely vital, and is also going to play a key role, I think, in the development of the government's levelling up agenda. We're going to continue to learn more about the interplay of identity and cohesion of belonging at local, regional and national levels. So we've broadened out to include 4 metropolitan areas in our research, and we'll continue to learn from our partners about what works, and our final report is due out in August 2021.
Thank you very much, Jo. That's a great introduction to the report. I have to say your gardening analogy is growing on me. I was not keen on it, but I think you've convinced me of that. Okay, we're now going to hear from a couple of local authority areas directly, those that have been involved in the scheme. And I'm delighted to introduce Zahra Niazi, who's the programme lead for Bradford Council on the Integration Strategy Communities Programme. And it runs under what I think is a great title of Bradford for Everyone. And of course, Bradford City Council is one of the 5 local areas to receive MHCLG funding as the integration areas, and a very prominent research partner for us too. Zahra.
Thank you, Ted. So I just wanted to start off with saying that over time, our stronger communities and neighbourhood services have been massively reduced due to austerity, but we've continued to maintain our locality working approach, which has been really important. So we were quite fortunate that in 2018, we were asked to become an integration area, and that led us to really focus on a range of interventions across our 4 pillars of getting on, getting along, getting involved and feeling safe, really focusing on all communities and areas across our district. And during COVID, we basically carried on. We adapted our projects where we could, moving online, you know, tailoring our response and being a central hub in coordinating activity. Bradford for Everyone really complements on our existing stronger communities work on community reassurance and engagement, celebrating and commemorating days of significance, volunteering and our VCS infrastructure support. I'm just going to highlight briefly what I think are probably the most 4 important recommendations in the report, although I think many of them are really interconnected and are all equally just as important. And along with that, I thought I'll just clarify a little bit about our approach about the same time as well. So the first one I wanted to touch on was a really round place where local government can be a real co-producer, convener, enabler. And I think there are 2 reasons why I think this recommendation is really important. The first is that the programme has been a really powerful catalyst for conversations, you know, really connecting services and supporting change for the good of people. But to achieve that ambition where, you know, our vision is to where everyone feels that they can belong, they feel understood, they feel safe and can actually access opportunities, we need to really strengthen the role of local government. We need the resources to do that, and the flexibility to deploy them according to local priorities and needs, and actually the time to do it really well. The second reason is that Bradford district is actually lots of different places and not one local place. We have lots of small towns, and we have lots of different places with relatively high levels of social capital, but they're not always where you might expect them to be. So we've always taken an almost hyper local approach to our work with communities and in neighbourhoods, with a really strong footprint and reach into communities via neighbourhood teams, and especially in COVID, this is where years of our grassroots work and community developments really paid off. And we also found that from many of our soft intelligence activities and harnessing existing relationships and the delivery of our ambassadors programme really started to build people's connections and sense of place through greater decision making, involvement, sense of ownership. And this actually enabled residents to become more involved in their area. And part of the COVID response, many of which took supporting to their own communities, which is really important. The other two recommendations in people I think are really important is around local leaders actually speaking up, promoting social cohesion in language that's accessible to all, and promoting and proactive tackling the barriers to inclusion of minority groups and represented groups as well. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think these two recommendations are really important. We know in our area that the terminology of integration and cohesion is really widely misunderstood and really oversimplified. And in some respects, this has been a real divider among communities and politicians. This isn't just limited to cohesion, but also equality, diversity, inclusion. Much of this is historical, where investments have come and gone over a relatively long period of time and over some very turbulent events, and they haven't been sustained, and there's been no consistent way of measuring impact of those investments. And this has continued to a certain extent, and sometimes has created some controversial perceptions. Cities where there's high levels of migration need people to prioritise and work on this. And we've got also things like policies that don't always work for our communities. And the gap between local and national in areas is widening, which is really worrying. So this really links in quite well with one of the recommendations about understanding the equality impact of policy and strategy and how important that is here. The other second sort of reasons around visibility and looking around who's on the table, who's acceptable, is really interlinked with who feels included, excluded, whether they feel they belong, have their own voice heard. Bradford has a long history of migration. We're a city of sanctuary and an intercultural city, but we need to obviously go further, longer, deeper, and with language and communications and leadership that is representative, asset-based, and shared by everyone. And as a very young city, we've developed during COVID more work into mentorship, leadership programs, activating our young people as youth ambassadors. And this has been really key in sharing information in a way that's relatable to young people. We also coordinated initiatives to support digital inclusion, such as our befriending scheme, Together Talks, and taking all of our ESOL work online to reach out to all groups and communities, building in support for people to get online with our VCS and residents taking a lead in that. The last recommendation that I want you to really point out and really struck me really was around the knowledge. So building competency, capacity, skills and knowledge in our VCS. The reason is for that is that we can't address inequalities without exploring the systems in which we operate and the structural systems that exist and ends up really discriminating people. We need to understand privilege and unconscious bias and what the impact of that is on opportunities for other people. And our VCS are, and they can be, a real advocate for that, enabling more people to understand how to engage with local authority and government and navigate through our complex systems. And because of the bridging role they play between local government and communities. In our response to COVID in Bradford, it was a collective response made up of VCSC partners, housing associations, the fire service, police, but many people were deployed into different roles. Organisations stepped up and were working in ways that was really fast-paced and mobilising services in such a short amount of time. The advantage, of course, was that we had this programme here that already developed a strong relationship with over 500 grassroots organisations, including Faith in the district. And this demonstrated the strength and the speed in which we could reach out to our communities and the important role the VCS actually played in doing that. By strengthening the infrastructure of VCS, what we can do is really help them transform their own services to respond better and add capacity to building strong social capital among residents. Some areas in Bradford, for instance, doesn't have any community infrastructure, and this actually mirrors the way our voting and volunteering is within the district, and that is actually quite low. I just wanted to end with just a few additional points on our approach. The main principles in our programme really amplified during COVID and has been sort of the foundation in which we undertook our approach and our work. And these are three things. One is around people. No matter who you are, what your background is, generally people want to help. We want the same things in life, and people will respond with a lot of goodwill and generosity when they're recognised as being part of a place and the role that they can play. And being able to monopolise that as an opportunity at scale and at pace was just incredibly important in terms of developing that infrastructure. Social cohesion being at the forefront, ensuring the safety of our communities by monitoring tensions and providing reassurance engagement, gathering intelligence, looking at our data and lived experience, and deeply thinking about solutions for long-term sustainable change. And that's really been enhanced and been a catalyst through the programme. And communications kind of really important as well, being reflective of our people, that is timely, it's accessible and reaches all communities, co-designing services and materials with not just the what, but also the who and how being just as essential. I just want to finally just end with really saying that we've got a lot to learn, and we can learn a lot from other people. So we certainly haven't got it nailed, but we do need to keep at it and keep learning and innovating. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zahra. Perfectly on time too. And a great reminder that there's not just one place built around a city. The hyper-local approach, I think, came across really well. Okay, we're now going on to another local area, Walsall. Welcome, Charlotte Gough, who is the Integration Partnership Engagement Officer at Walsall Council, one of 5 local areas to be part of MHCLG's Areas Programme, and obviously also a research partner for Beyond Us and Them. Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Ted, for the introduction, and thank you to Belong for inviting me to speak at this webinar today. Having kind of gone through the latest reports, the examples and case studies featured is just a testament of the resilience, leadership and support we've shown while working with communities throughout the COVID pandemic. I firstly just want to reflect on some of the recommendations that have been outlined in the latest paper on policy and practice. So there's 3 recommendations I would like to touch upon. So the first one is using the arts, sports and cultural activities to reach a common goal, putting communities in charge. I definitely feel that arts, sports and cultural activities shape our communities and places we live and work in. And these form of activities bring to life the diversity of our local areas. They tell the stories of the past and present and create visions for brighter futures. In Walsall, last year, we did a lot of work around Black History Month. We gave our communities the opportunity to tell their stories from their perspective. And we had contributions from so many different backgrounds. We gave the guidance on what to contribute, and they did the rest. So many were hugely impressed by what we did, particularly when we hosted our webinar at the end of October, bringing speakers in from different sectors. The second one I'd like to touch upon is encouraging active social engagement among residents, recognising and rewarding volunteers. So we realised that a lot of our voluntary groups became at the forefront of the pandemic, providing essential services to vulnerable residents through the Resilient Communities model. And residents saw what our voluntary groups were doing, and there was a real need to support others, but also ensuring that our volunteers and our groups were recognised for the work they were doing. So Walsall decided to do a Star Volunteers Award, and we recognised over 50 people for their contribution to society and for going the extra mile during the pandemic as unsung heroes. And we never thought that we would get so many nominations, and everyone who was nominated was a winner. We wanted to recognise everyone equally because of all the tremendous work they were doing. So everyone received the certificates for being recognised, but also we had an opportunity to share people's stories of why they felt they deserved to be nominated. And the final recommendation I wanted to touch upon was shared national framework of local cohesion measures. So local areas targeting resources to rebuild and recover and building knowledge of what works and contribute to learning nationally. Across all the local authorities involved in cohesion integration work, I think we all have something to offer to the table in terms of best practice. And in Walsall, we find it helpful to share what works for us. And sharing knowledge is not only a best practice exercise, but it's also a chance to reflect on the successes, the challenges, and where things we could improve. We usually get opportunities to share on a regional level and national level. So, for example, we recently were invited to attend the West Midlands Combined Authority Community Cohesion Roundtable, and we just shared some of our key achievements, statistics, and learning from the last year, despite being in a pandemic. I now just want to reflect on kind of some of the things we've been doing in Walsall based on the core principles of local trust, social mixing, and social connectedness. When the first lockdown was imminent, we had to make a decision to stop all of our face-to-face activity as a result of, the pandemic. It was just really emerging. And however, this didn't stop the work in Walsall. The pandemic brought lots of opportunities to strengthen cohesion and look at new ways of working and engagement. So firstly, local trust. We wanted to build a better relationship and better network with our local community groups and places of worship throughout the pandemic. So we provided specialist guidance, increased efforts such as raising awareness of COVID-19 prevention, vaccines and testing. We recently supported the local CCG with some pop-up vaccination clinics, one in a mosque, one in a Gurdwara. We had a chance to talk to residents about what it felt like to receive the vaccine, medical professionals, and also record messages from community leaders and doctors in those different languages. It was a very positive experience overall. Next thing I want to touch upon is social mixing. So, for example, one of our flagship projects, Community Dialogue, which was in partnership with the Faith and Belief Forum, it was moved to online provision. We had 23 groups with over 130 participants involved in the online sessions. Strong relationships have been formed between groups who wouldn't usually get involved in social mixing. For example, they may not be used to doing this kind of thing, but actually a number of our grassroots and emerging groups have been empowered into doing some social action work as a result of getting involved in community dialogue. And the final point I want to touch upon is social connectedness. So an example of this is the DWP Community Connectors work, where we've been running sessions for women online to help them get back into work. And this is kind of come in the form of empowerment workshops, motivate your mind workshops for health and well-being, and also virtual coffee mornings. And all of these have been shaped according to the women's needs. Some of the ladies who were part of a previous online workshop, they set up a WhatsApp group. And the reason because they did that was they wanted to connect with each other and help each other along the way. And it goes to show that, how powerful technology can be in connecting people. And it also shows that, you are not alone. So I want to conclude that the work that's taken place in Walsall and in many other local areas across the country, despite a pandemic, we can still come together in new ways. We can empower each other to be connected and let people know, we are still here for you. I want to read a short sentence that I've extracted from the conclusion recommendations of the latest report. And it goes, in order to build a kinder, fairer and more cohesive British society, we need to strengthen the ties that bind us and in particular, those ties that bridge between different groups, communities and regions. So as we move out the lockdown, I hope that we will be able to continue to do what we are doing right now. And the work that we have done throughout the pandemic has been really impactful. Let us not lose what we have achieved throughout our response to COVID-19, and let's continue to have those meaningful connections with local partners across the sector. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand back over to Ted.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's great to hear some more positive stories, and Walsall certainly seems to have a good number of them. We're now going to go over to Ruth Hollis from Spirit 2012. I'm delighted to have Ruth here. I think when the Legacy project was first announced, I was a bit unsure about how it would work and whether it would have an impact, even though it had £47 million, I think, associated with it. But it's done such a great job, and the passion and commitment to communities and well-being, I think, just shines through. So delighted to have you, Ruth.
Well, thank you very much, Ted, and huge thanks for the invitation to come and speak to you today. Spirit were delighted to contribute to the research and support the recommendations set out in the paper. It's really hard to follow the brilliant stuff that's happening in Walsall and Bradford, but I hope to draw out some of the themes that Charlotte and Zahra have already talked about, bringing to life so brilliantly what's happening in the report. So as Ted has said, Spirit's purpose as a funder is to use events and volunteering as a pathway to increased well-being and a way that we can build social connectedness for all people in their communities. As well as funding programmes around the legacy of events, we fund wider projects and research to get under the skin of how and why participatory activities increase people's well-being and their sense of connectedness, so that we can feed that into how we and others design and deliver projects. And we want to particularly pay most attention for those people who might have the lowest starting point. So people with health and well-being inequalities, people who don't feel connected to their communities. Supporting volunteering is a really big strand of our work, as it would be coming from that kind of genesis of events, particularly around how volunteering can support people to come together. So we fund things like the Great Get Together and their brilliant network of local Great Get Together volunteers, the whole volunteers that came out of City of Culture in 2017. We're working with Local Trust at the moment to develop a youth funding programme, which will include a volunteer element to engage young people to be involved with the anniversaries and events next year. So the Commonwealth Games, the Platinum Jubilee and Festival UK 2022. And we're also at the moment commissioning research into inclusive volunteering, which we see as enabling disabled and non-disabled people to volunteer together, as well as people from different backgrounds. And the team at Spirit are absolutely delighted to talk to anyone if you're interested in any of these areas. But what I wanted to do is focus briefly on 3 areas in response to the report that really resonate for us at Spirit. And luckily they've already been brilliantly touched on by Zahra and Charlotte, so it should amplify their messages. So the 3 areas I want to talk briefly about are place, which we've seen come through as very important in this report, the potential of events, sport and arts in bringing people together, and the common thread that ran through it, which was volunteering. And as I do that, I'll try and draw out what some of the recommendations may mean in terms of policy asks, and particularly for funders. So firstly, and Zahra started with it as well, and Jo spoke about it brilliantly, you know, place matters. The research has generated some really important findings on place, and we've heard that reflected, as I've said, by Zahra and Charlotte. And it's shown, as Jo said, that comparatively small amounts of investment, funding made available from the Integrated Communities Action Plan in this instance, has made a really positive impact on social cohesion in those areas, in terms of higher levels of trust, political trust and trust between people, and higher levels of engagement in local communities compared to those who live outside those areas. So for policymakers and funders, we need to consider how we build on the impact of this investment in creating the conditions for successful cohesion projects, and how they can be replicated in areas without integration areas or similar funding. The report has also highlighted the need for investment in the local VCSE infrastructure to support this work, and Zahra's examples of how they've worked across Bradford were brilliant. Interestingly, that's exactly the same recommendation as the APPG on loneliness has made today, although they're focusing on local infrastructure through the lens of social prescribing and how to support social prescribing to tackle loneliness. This is a key challenge that all of us need to respond to. We need to make sure that this evidence and the APPG recommendation reaches decision makers. As we come out of the pandemic at a time where charities have been hit really hard, we all need to be better at making the case for the pivotal role of local charities, faith and voluntary organisations in improving social cohesion and connectedness, particularly to our mayors and councillors, to our local MPs and to ministers. And for funders, this makes the balance between funding national organisations and making sure that funding really supports local infrastructure and comes from a place of understanding local infrastructure even more vital than it's been before. Finally, one of the striking but perhaps not surprising findings in the report was about the impact of investing in how a place perceives itself. That creating a positive story of pride and place has been instrumental in developing those conditions for social cohesion. We've also seen the power of this investment in pride through our work in Hull as part of City of Culture. And that brings me on to the second area to draw out, which is, that we were delighted that the report highlighted the power of events, both national and local, and engagement in sport and the arts. What we saw in Hull before and during 2017 was that increase in civic pride, and bear in mind that for many years Hull was told that it topped the table of UK's rubbish towns, although the book wasn't called Rubbish Towns. That civic pride increased people's willingness to volunteer, to engage in their community, and their confidence to engage in arts and culture. One volunteer told me, "I used to look at the ground and now I look to the stars." 3 years on during the pandemic, we saw those volunteers come back to support their communities, which was enabled by infrastructure put in place essentially for an arts festival. We need to be able to measure and build on that increase in pride. How do we measure the lift of the chin and the swelling of the chest, and the long-term impact that events infrastructure can have for a place after the circus has left town? 2022 is a year of mega events for the UK. We've got the Commonwealth Games, we've got a Jubilee, there's the Festival UK. We need to make sure we really harness that investment in place to build on the social impacts highlighted in the Belong report. Charlotte's already touched on this, but we also know that taking part in sports and cultural activity can increase intergroup social contact across faith and ethnic divides, and sport and the arts can imbue a sense of local pride and help develop shared identities. The report mentions the Breaking Boundaries project that we fund and is delivered by Youth Sport Trust, Sporting Equals and local partners. This uses cricket to bring young people, their families and communities together, working in 5 areas, including Bradford. And what it does essentially is to support and enable young cricketers to become inspiration champions. Sadly, they haven't been able to play much cricket this year, as you can imagine. So these young champions have been forging connections in their communities by delivering food parcels to vulnerable people, running online meetings, and writing to care home residents to combat loneliness. And whilst purposeful social mixing was much harder in a virtual environment, it is projects like this that bring communities together, particularly where some of the conditions for social cohesion have been established through endeavours like the integration areas. So finally, how do we supercharge the upswing we seem to be seeing in volunteering? Over the last year, the contribution of volunteers has been really visible and rightly celebrated. People have come forward as informal volunteers to help their neighbours, running WhatsApp groups and collecting shopping. Hundreds of thousands of people gave their time to food banks or came forward to support the NHS. At the same time, our regular volunteering has carried on. Charity fundraisers have continued to raise money. Trustees and school governors have met, albeit in very changed circumstances. A couple of weeks ago, the Together Coalition suggested that 12.4 million people volunteered in 2020, with 4.6 million new volunteers, which is a phenomenal number. In the areas highlighted in the Belong report, thousands of people have been involved in the COVID-19 relief effort, which the research shows has often crossed ethnic and faith divides. And we're looking forward to the Radical Kindness report, which will bring this out further. In the integration areas, people were twice as likely to volunteer compared to people living elsewhere, which is a huge credit to the work and the infrastructure that they've put in place. So we absolutely agree with the need for greater investment in volunteering. And we also agree that it's important to have a varied volunteer offer. We need to understand that not everybody is able to or willing to offer their time on a regular basis. The report says starting small by engaging in low level activity like litter picking in a local park can lead to greater engagement. We absolutely agree with that. Starting with something like going to or organising a great get together can be a brilliant pathway into volunteering. We also support the recommendations for local volunteer champions and for developing a digital volunteer platform. I think the challenge for all of us now is to build on this community spirit and encourage those people that gave their time for the first time last year to continue. And I think that if the proposals in the Belong report were implemented, this would go a long way to help retain those new volunteers. I've seen Ted. So just finally, all of the panellists were asked to expand on the principles that Belong set out in the report. The challenge as I see it actually isn't to come up with more proposals, but to be much better at securing the salience and political will to implement the ideas we've already got, both nationally and locally. For funders and policymakers, it's to work locally to build on and work with the great work that's already happening in communities. We'd like to see the Integrated Communities Action Plan extended after its funding runs out in 2022, or similar put in place, and more investment in programmes to encourage integration and social cohesion. Integration, social cohesion, social connection have always been conditions which we see as a good idea, but perhaps never quite top of the in tray. And in a year of a comprehensive spending review, raising this profile is one of the most important challenges for all of us in terms of recovery and renewal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Another great presentation. And I have to say your point about civic pride and the impact on personal pride is really well made. I think that's really important. Okay, we're going on now to Thom Livsey from MHCLG. And Thom, you have the distinction of actually having had a question before you've even spoken. So you may well cover that. If not, we will come back to it. But in a way, I guess you're responding to some of the points that are being raised. Thom is Head of Integration at MHCLG and leads on the Integration Areas programme. So who better to respond? Thanks very much, Thom.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ted. And thanks to Joe and her team for inviting me along today. I'm really pleased to be with you. Supporting people and places by working with, alongside and in collaboration with local authorities and local partners is key to the work we do in MHCLG. I think we've heard a lot of that already from certainly those from Walsall and Bradford. And will continue to be as we move to recovery from COVID, as well as building that longer term resilience, which will be ever so important. The paper reflects views I share about some of the ways to best achieve this, with the connection between national and local government being at its heart. As Ted said at the start there, I lead the Integration Area Programme, so I know Zahra and Charlotte well, and it was brilliant to hear their remarks and hear their kind of local stories, if you like, about what's actually happening on the ground, which again, and they've heard this from me a million times, is so important to us in national government to really understand what we're doing, does it work, and also challenge us in terms of policy design. So that was brilliant, and it was also great to hear from Ruth just before. As I think Zahra said, we launched the Integration Area Programme back in April 2018, which now seems like an absolute eternity ago, with the aim of focusing local and national resource on a common goal to deliver integrated communities, working with 5 local authorities referenced in this paper. The programme was set up to and has evolved further to meet local needs through local strategies designed and agreed by local partnership boards, which are a range of local partners to ensure as broad a local buy-in is achieved to get interventions the best chance of success. These same networks have been called upon at speed, as we've already heard, during the pandemic and worked. They worked because I guess none of this happens overnight, and what I think was really demonstrated through this paper and previous reports and what I've heard from the 5 areas that I know well is none of this happens overnight. This is time that has been spent kind of investing funding, but also getting to know communities, making those inroads with communities, local leaders. So when there were issues, when a year ago COVID hit, they were able to kind of unlock and tap into that very quickly. And I think it's really demonstrated in, which I was fascinated by in this report, in terms of the level of trust, in terms of messaging, what we're saying as national government, trust in local politicians, which has been fundamental. And we've seen where perhaps that's not worked as well across the course of the last 12 months, and where it has, and demonstrated in this report. I should also say it's really unusual, and it was different for me when I joined this team, for central and local government to collaborate so closely as we have done through this programme. It's certainly something which I want to see replicated in other programmes, and it's something I champion in Whitehall with other departments, and I know is still viewed actually as a very different way to do things. But clearly for me it is working, and this paper I think demonstrates that. A golden thread through the integration area programme and the other programmes that we look after in my team, so on English language, and the relatively new Community Champions programme, which was launched in January of this year, is a sense of place. People feeling connected to their street, town, city, interventions informed with local knowledge and set by local ambition, ensuring a person feels connected to but also heard in the place they call home. The findings in this paper demonstrate the difference and positive impacts that can be made with foundations laid by building relationships between national and local government, local communities and more, with people always sitting at its heart. We've seen over the past year, as I've said, COVID has washed over all of us. People have more than before an understanding of what local national government should be doing, and have varying views on that, and improved connection to their street, town, city that for some was not there before. We only need to look at our own personal experience to understand the importance of social connection, and I think we can all feel this, and the vital role local government plays to support this, and continues to do so. I think we've also seen over the past year that the connection to place means more, and I think is understood more than it ever did before. Going back to lockdown 1, where I was suddenly taking walks around my local, where I live, getting to know neighbours more than ever before. People do look to their neighbours for support, whether for food shopping or just a simple hello in the morning, which means a lot to people. Our shared experiences have exposed so much, including those in our communities who need our support, but were not aware of the need until everything changed a year ago for everybody. This shows that despite the limits placed on social interaction, people are becoming increasingly aware of the challenges and hardships faced by others. Is again of real interest to me in the work that we do in MHCLG, and will inform not only this programme of work, but other work we're doing in the division that I work in. To the future, this paper builds our evidence that this approach, place-based, working in collaboration with local authorities, being led by local knowledge of the opportunities and challenges, is working. I think we're clearer now about what works and what could be better. The speed to which these local authorities were able to tap into their networks and build the trust needed for shielding, wellbeing activities, vaccine take-up, the promotion of, and a million other things, is supported by the foundations each LA built with residents over time. I want to see the energy, goodwill and volunteering that we've seen over the past year really harnessed, as kind of Ruth alluded to provide a positive legacy from this period, taking the good from what has been an extremely challenging year, and I think will probably continue to be for many of us throughout this year. I think through the LA programme, we're on the right track. For me, it's where we go next that is key, ensuring we understand at the national level that the local landscape has changed, taking with us the lessons of yesterday to inform what we want to achieve next, with a place-based, localised approach that we have seen work so well in the integration areas, informing that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's great to hear about the collaboration between central and local government as well. Could I just go back to this question that came earlier, specifically about the Communities Action Plan funding after 2022? I seem to remember as well that in the original plans, after the initial areas, it was intended to actually have a number of additional areas as well. So can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So it's a lot has changed clearly in the last year. So at the beginning of 2020, we were having discussions about how the program would develop from there. We were seeing some of those early findings come back and looking to expand. I think COVID has changed a lot of that. So we've had to, I think probably like many local authorities, pause some of that work. What we've done though, I think, and it was kind of alluded to by, I think, Zahra and Charlotte actually, is we've seen through the 5 areas that the work they were doing through the programme, they adapted to deliver that local COVID response. We've seen through the English language programmes that we run, the same has happened there, and we're seeing that now with the community champions work. So what we're doing at the moment is kind of looking at those experiences, the evidence we can gather at the moment, and see what that might look like going forward. I think the priority is quite interesting. I think COVID has really shone a light on this work and the importance of the work. I think I've probably said this to Joe before. I found it challenging at times to demonstrate how this work makes a difference. I'm not in a housing team. It's not about building units in a place. It's about making people feel a connection to a place. How do you measure that? And I think what we've seen through the COVID response, and it's something we internally in Walsall has come to us for a lot of help in terms of promoting the vaccine take-up, for example, is we understand it's about getting to know the local authority, trusting them to know their area and how best to support that. So there's a very long answer to say I'm very hopeful for what is coming next. I think what we're really keen to do is ensure that what's happened over the past year really informs and shapes what that looks like.
Good. Thank you very much. Great. Really just now opportunity for more questions to all the panelists or any particular panelists, and just looking through some of the questions which are coming in. I think Mike Fraser had a question. Can we go to Mike Fraser?
Sorry to intervene, Ted, but I think you will need to ask Mike's question for him because we don't have that function enabled on the session.
My question for Thom, this is from Mike Fraser, is that unlike previous short-term unmeasured initiatives, we need a political commitment that this MHCLG initiative, now validated by the University of Kent study, must be committed to. I think to some extent you've covered that, Thom, but could you just respond to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I spoke at the session Belong ran a few weeks ago, and I think I probably said the same there, that this is building up the evidence for that argument, that case to be made internally. I think it's understood, as I probably said a few minutes ago, more now, certainly across the department, across Walsall, about the importance of this work, because it's really been highlighted by the way LAs have been able to respond to the COVID effort. So I think the last year has really kind of shone a light on what's worked and what can work. Yeah, so I think we're in a positive place internally in terms of where this is going next. It's what it looks like, what's the scope of it, and what it might be called is probably what we're thinking about currently.
Okay, thanks. You've also got a question from Zahra, and as I can see Zahra, I'm going to ask her to put it herself.
Is this allowed, panelist to panelist?
Probably not. Well,
it's fine.
I think it is actually somebody from the audience. It's not me.
Oh, sorry, another Zahra.
It doesn't have a H in it.
I will put it in. You're quite right. It's from another Zahra. Will other government departments be adopting a collaborative approach with local authorities in the same way MHCLG has done with the Integrated Areas Programme? You just have to say yes, Thom.
Yeah, I would like to see it, and it's something we push a lot for in our dealings with, I know, DCMS, Home Office, DWP, DHSC, DFE, etc. But it is, interestingly, in a lot of meetings now, it's something is either on the agenda or we talk about a lot, which wasn't there 3 years ago, and it's kind of increasing. So that's a positive step. But as people appreciate, these things take time.
Okay. A question to Ruth from Justine. Thanks for all the excellent work done during Cohesion and Integration. Does Spirit 2012 have any future plan for the high number of volunteers after or post-pandemic?
Yeah, so we've got a number of things happening. I think, our first priority at the moment is working with some of our current grant holders to think about how they can adapt as they come out of the pandemic. So really brilliant initiatives like the Great Get Together, like Breaking Boundaries, the whole volunteers. There's a real challenge about how existing volunteer programs come out of the pandemic, really harnessing that good learning. So we want to work with them. We've got a couple of new initiatives. So I think I mentioned we're developing a youth volunteering initiative with the local trust. We really think that harnessing the brilliant social action and volunteering young people have shown during the pandemic is really important, and it's an important part of giving back to young people that have sacrificed so much during this period. We're also doing lots of research, because what we want to do is bring together all of the evidence around volunteering from the events over the last 10 years to really make that policy case for how we continue to develop volunteering, to adapt and to put that infrastructure into place.
Thanks very much, Ruth. A question from Emma. I think it's probably principally to Thom, but it may be for others to comment on. What do you think the opportunity is for this work to help with public health campaigns, e.g. stopping smoking, healthy eating, etc.? And in the case of Thomas, do you work with DHSC on this? I mean, there are some general lessons, aren't there? And I thought your similarity, Ruth, between this and dealing with loneliness and the APG report was an indication of that. Any response from any of the panelists? And Jo?
Well, I'd love to hear from Zahra and Charlotte in particular on this, because I think they'll have things to share just in terms of the last year. But I think what's absolutely central, and I was trying to point that out in my presentation really, is that trust and the role of trust is vital to so many different agendas. It's absolutely essential to a public health agenda in terms of being able to engage with some of those communities and groups who might actually suffer the worst health inequalities at a local level. It's absolutely vital in terms of the rollout of the vaccine, you know, trusted local interlocutors who can have those conversations and encourage people and sort of develop the social norms around vaccine take-up are absolutely critical. You know, in terms of mental health, social cohesion is absolutely vital in terms of mental health. I just think in those 6 local areas, you know, that the benefits for people who are maybe on their own, of having someone who knocks on their door and asks how they are, or who invites them round for a cuppa, or who turns up in their neighbourhood dressed up in a Superman outfit to entertain them, you know, for sort of an hour on a Tuesday or something, or entertain the street, you know, which are some of the stories we've been collecting through our Radical Kindness project. I think that it's in all sorts of sort of hidden, both small and big ways that it relates to public health. But I'd love to hear from Zahra and Charlotte as well.
Good. Zahra or Charlotte? Zahra.
Thank you. Yeah, I think absolutely there's an opportunity for us to work quite closely with public health, and we have been doing that. Perhaps just a little bit indirectly because of the continuous models that we've developed in Bradford, especially around understanding and knowing our communities, has been actually quite important about how health messages and campaigns are actually developed, not just in terms of what they look like, the languages and the accessibility, but the whole element of actually how you collaborate with communities and co-design messages. And going back to that point I mentioned before, it's more, what we found is what works very well with our communities is actually who's delivering the message. So having your community leaders quite present in those messaging, having community ambassadors, local people within the area that are trusted, that are known, respected. And I think that has really combated things like thinking about rumours or thinking about misinformation that might be spreading. But actually, along with that, I think it's about the connections and the peer-to-peer support that you get from that by making sure that you're working within a community and in a neighbourhood, rather than just having campaigns that go out. I think we've also used in Bradford quite a bit of work around behavioural science. So just really trying to understand much deeply about the way people understand information, because there are cultural differences. And so bringing that all together, the science of it, the storytelling, getting the local people and actually using local people within an area has made a huge impact about how we can support actually these kind of local health campaigns.
Thanks, Zahra. Charlotte, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We've also been working closely with public health over the last year, and we've just been really working closely with all of our communities to just understand what their needs are, and also getting out some localised material in various different languages and alternative formats. And we've been, continually pushing these out on a very regular basis. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to enable our communities to have access to that information in a way that is appropriate for them. So just to give a very quick example, on the Walsall website, we do have a resource page of alternative formats, translations on different COVID messages around testing, self-isolation, and also most recently the vaccinations. And we do continue to work closely with public health on any new and emerging trends that we can look at in terms of getting out new campaigns in Walsall. And as we do start to roll out the community champions work here, there'll be more opportunities to work closely with all of our community partners.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. There's another question here, which I think is quite important, from Zahra, who asks, how has access to digital devices for local residents supported the rollout of these fantastic schemes? Digital inclusion has really been highlighted during this pandemic. What has been done to influence policymakers? Who would like to respond to that? It's a really good point, and the digital divide is definitely still there.
Can I come in on that, Ted?
Yes, do.
Yeah, so it was one of the things when the pandemic first hit that lots of our projects said, well, we're going to have to go online, we're going to have to jump digitally. And it wasn't, I think, for a month or so, or even longer, that we really, really understood not just the digital divide in terms of people's access to technology, people's access to data, and a lot of that actually was driven, particularly for young people, through schools and schools identifying that digital divide. But also understanding how digital engagement needs to be different, the safeguarding elements around digital inclusion, the intrusion of, you're in my back bedroom, we're all in each other's houses. For young people, inviting even trusted adults, let alone strangers, into their personal space and their homes has been a real challenge. So I think absolutely we need to do some work on the digital divide, getting devices out there, getting data packages to people, and a lot of our projects, we've seen some brilliant work doing that. But I think we also need to think about how we use digital really responsibly and reflecting the needs of people and how they're going to engage.
Do Zahra or Charlotte just want to come back on what's happened in your local areas? Charlotte.
Yeah, so I think one of the examples I do want to reflect on is our ESOL work. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we had to make the decision to move all of our provision online, and one of them was ESOL. So thankfully, our ESOL intelligence unit have been working extremely hard to get all their learning online, and this has been recognised across the board, really. So not only that the provisions have been moved online, but the team are taking opportunities to encourage people to learn how to use Zoom, how to use the different functions, how to log on and access online classes. And also for those who are not able to access a digital device because of IT proficiencies, then we have the provision of home learning packs, and that just gives an opportunity for ESOL learners to kind of go through the learning week by week, and also have telephone conversations with their tutors on progress.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Zahra, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think just echoing what Charlotte has really said, we adapted quite a lot of our projects, but we also commissioned a number of projects that looked to repurpose all laptops, for instance. We looked at schemes that basically gave out iPads, working with primary schools so people could actually get access online. But we also need to recognise the fact that the the work around digital inclusion is much more wider, because we're talking about digital skills, we're talking about the technology, we're talking about the Wi-Fi access. And actually in places like Bradford, we've got many people in the district that just are just in that kind of poverty line. So they're not going to be able to access some of those things. So I think there's a combination of how do we innovate and how do we adapt our delivery that's also going to be safe under the restrictions and the guidelines that we've got. The other thing as well is it's not going to be a solution for all. So I think it does need to be something a bit more wider than just a local government. Local authority needs to be central government looking at that in terms of a much more robust kind of plan about how we increase digital skills, access, technology to everybody basically. In Bradford, we are working on a digital inclusion strategy, and we have thought quite different ways in which we can bring in, whether it's like central points, for example, in the city centre where the Wi-Fi is free access, where we think about where we're using more venues where you can have access to technology, laptops, iPad, etc. But I think again, this really needs a lot more thought, a lot more investment. It's not something that a single city will be able to do on their own.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zahra. I think that's absolutely right, and I think we're getting to the point that digital access is becoming as important as access to water, access to gas and electricity. At some point, we're going to have to consider digital access just like any other utility. And that is the policy change, which is, I think, going to have to emerge from this and future developments. I think we've reached the end of our time. Thank you all so much to our panelists for great presentations, answering the questions so well. Thank you also to the audience for putting those questions to you, and of course our research partners who've helped develop this whole process, and I hope we'll stick with it because there's still a long way to go, I think, in learning the lessons and developing policy responses, and of course developing the practice. So thank you all very much. I'm going to close the seminar, and I'm going to urge you to go away and tend your cohesion garden. Thank you all very much.